Brooklyn, 1991. A hospital room on the fourth floor of a federal medical facility. A man is dying. The room has a window. Outside it, nothing worth looking at. Inside it, a bed, a monitor, a chair pulled close enough to suggest someone was expected. The chair is empty. The man in the bed had spent 40 years earning the kind of loyalty that fills chairs. He had one visitor the entire final week. It was not the man he had asked for. It was not the man who owed him the most. The man who owed him the most had made a decision. He had chosen a prosecutor's office over a deathbed, and the dying man knew it. He had known it for months. That chair being empty was not an accident. It was a verdict. Salvatore, Sammy the Bull, Gravano, and Paul Castellano built the Gambino crime family into the most powerful criminal organization in American history together. And then Gravano helped dismantle it, brick by brick, starting with the man who trusted him most. If you've ever wondered how the most powerful mob family in New York history collapsed from the inside out, hit subscribe. This channel covers the real mechanics of power, how it's built, how it's lost, and why the people who lose it almost always hand it over themselves. Gravano grew up in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. Not wealthy, not connected, just a kid from a neighborhood where certain men drove certain cars and nobody asked questions about where the money came from. He was small, which got him into fights early. He won most of them, which got him noticed. By 16, he was running with a crew. By his early 20s, he was being looked at by the Gambino family as someone worth developing. He was smart, controlled, and completely unafraid of violence. Not reckless unafraid. Calculated unafraid. There is a difference. The reckless ones die young. Gravano understood the difference before he had words for it. Paul Castellano came from the same world, but through a different door. His father was connected. His brother-in-law was Carlo Gambino himself. He didn't climb the ladder. He was placed near the top of it and climbed the last few rungs. By the time he became boss in 1976, he had never spent a day hungry, never spent a night wondering whether his crew respected him, never had to prove himself the way street men prove themselves. He ran the family like a CEO. Clean hands, tailored suits. A mansion on Staten Island that people called the White House. He thought that distance from the street made him sophisticated. It made him blind. That blindness was Castellano's fatal flaw, and it showed up early, documented, specific, and impossible to miss if you were paying attention. In 1979, Castellano issued a standing order inside the Gambino family. No drug dealing. Any member caught trafficking narcotics would be killed. The order was absolute. The reasoning was practical. Drugs brought federal heat, long sentences, and men who talked to reduce them. What Castellano did not understand, or refused to understand, was that he was issuing that order to men who were already dealing. Men whose entire income structure depended on it. He was not preventing a behavior. He was driving it underground. And underground is where things fester. He knew this on some level. There is a recorded FBI surveillance transcript from 1983 in which Castellano says, of his own captains, "Half of them are lying to me." He said it without anger, almost with resignation. A boss who has accepted that his men lie to him has already lost the essential thing a boss cannot lose, which is the credible belief in every man beneath him, that he sees everything and forgets nothing. Gravano heard that transcript later. He said it told him everything he needed to know about where Castellano's head was. The organization Gravano entered was structured in a way that rewarded patience and punished impatience. 5 families. A commission. Rules about who could be killed, who had to be asked, who had to be told. Every act of violence required authorization from above unless the situation was immediate and the threat was direct. This was not sentiment. This was engineering. The commission existed because unregulated violence between families had nearly destroyed all of them in the 1930s. The rules were written in the bodies of the men who hadn't followed them. Gravano rose through that structure correctly. He made his bones. He was formally inducted. He earned his promotions through a combination of demonstrated loyalty and demonstrated ruthlessness, in exactly the proportions the organization rewarded. By the early 1980s, he was a captain. By the mid-1980s, he was being talked about as something more. Castellano watched the rise. He respected Gravano's competence. He did not fully respect the man. There is a distinction Gravano himself has drawn in interviews between being used and being valued. Castellano used him. In 1982, Gravano and a small crew were involved in the murder of a man named Frank Fiala. Fiala was a drug dealer and arms trafficker who had purchased a nightclub from Gravano, then attempted to renegotiate the terms of the sale at gunpoint, in front of witnesses, after moving his own men into the location without authorization. Gravano killed him on the street outside the club. The killing was not authorized in advance by Castellano. It was done on instinct, in response to a direct threat, and then reported after the fact. Castellano was furious. Gravano was fined. The fine was substantial, but what the incident actually established, beneath the surface of the punishment, was something more important. It established that Gravano would act when action was required, answer for it honestly, absorb the consequence, and move forward without resentment. Every man in the Gambino family who was watching understood what they had seen. They had seen a man who would not freeze. In an organization that ran on controlled violence, that was not a liability. It was a credential. John Gotti was watching. He filed it away. Castellano's drug order began producing consequences in 1984. Gene Gotti and John Carneglia, members of John Gotti's crew, men Gotti was personally close to, were indicted on heroin trafficking charges. The indictment made clear they had been dealing for years. This meant they had been dealing in direct violation of Castellano's standing order. It meant Gotti had known. It meant Castellano's order had been ignored, openly, by one of his most prominent captains. Castellano did not move against Gotti. He deliberated. He consulted. He moved slowly in the manner of a man who believes that the appearance of control is the same as control. Gotti interpreted the slowness correctly. It was not restraint. It was hesitation. And hesitation, in that world, is an invitation. By 1985, Castellano had compounded his exposure by becoming personally involved with his housekeeper, Gloria Olarte, a relationship that was known, discussed, and quietly mocked by men who were supposed to fear him. He was spending less time on family business and more time managing a domestic situation that had made him, in the eyes of his own captains, something uncomfortably close to ridiculous. An FBI bug planted in his kitchen was recording his conversations. He knew the bug was there. He kept talking. In November 1985, Castellano and his new underboss, Thomas Bellotti, were indicted in the commission case, a sweeping federal prosecution targeting the leadership of all 5 families. Castellano was now facing the prospect of dying in prison. He began restructuring the family in ways that suggested he was planning for a future that didn't include most of the men currently serving under him. He promoted men loyal to himself. He sidelined men loyal to Gotti. Gotti decided Castellano had to go. Gravano agreed. And Gravano's agreement was not a minor detail. Gravano was the operational architect of what came next. He identified the location. He coordinated the shooters. He managed the logistics of an assassination that had to be executed cleanly, in public, in Midtown Manhattan, against the sitting boss of the most powerful crime family in America. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti were shot and killed outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street. Gotti became boss. Gravano became underboss. What they had built together that night was not just a transfer of power. It was a debt. Gravano had taken the same risk as Gotti, had done more of the operational work than Gotti, had put himself in the same legal exposure as Gotti. The bond was sealed in the most permanent currency available to men in their position. They were equally guilty of the same thing. Neither could move against the other without implicating himself. Or so Gravano believed. The years that followed gave Gravano everything he had spent his life positioning himself to receive. He was underboss of the Gambino family under the most famous mob boss in America. He controlled construction rackets, generating tens of millions annually. He had authority, money, and the kind of institutional credibility that takes decades to accumulate. He had earned every piece of it through competence, patience, and a willingness to absorb consequences without complaint. And then the FBI came. In December 1990, Gotti and Gravano were arrested on charges, including the Castellano murder. The evidence was extensive. The centerpiece was a surveillance recording from an apartment above the Rave Night social club in which Gotti, on tape, discussed criminal operations in explicit detail and, critically, made disparaging comments about Gravano. He called Gravano greedy. He suggested Gravano's construction dealings were creating problems for the family. He talked about Gravano the way a man talks about a subordinate he is considering removing. Gravano's lawyers played him the tape. This is the moment the entire structure collapsed. Not the arrest, not the charges. The tape. Specifically what was on it. Specifically, what Gotti had said about the man who had organized the murder that made Gotti's career. Gravano had spent his life operating inside an institution built on loyalty. He had killed for that institution. He had accepted fines, accepted demotions, accepted the chain of command. All of it premised on a loyalty that was supposed to run in both directions. The tape told him it didn't. In November 1991, Salvatore Gravano agreed to cooperate with the federal government. He became the highest-ranking member of the American Mafia ever to turn government witness. He provided testimony on 19 murders. He described the internal operations of the Gambino family in detail that no prosecutor had ever obtained from a source this close to the center. He named names, dates, locations, and methods. Gotti's legal team had one viable strategy: make Gravano the story. Argue that the government's star witness was a serial killer who had traded 19 murders for a reduced sentence. Make the jury look at Gravano and decide they could not convict a man on the word of someone that dangerous. It didn't work. John Gotti was convicted on April 2, 1992, on all counts including murder, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Two people asked Gravano not to testify. The first was his wife, Deborah. She understood what cooperation meant, not just legally, but structurally. It meant the end of everything they had built. It meant a life in witness protection, new names, new cities, permanent exile from the only world either of them had ever known. She asked him to find another way. He told her there was no other way. The conversation, by his own account, lasted less than 10 minutes. The second person who asked was his son, Gerard. Gerard Gravano had grown up inside the life. He knew what cooperation meant to the men his father had served alongside. He was not asking his father to protect the institution. He was asking his father to protect the family name, the relationships, the identity that had defined their entire existence. Gravano told him the same thing he had told his wife. The answer was no. What Gravano would do was testify and survive. What he would not do was die in a federal prison for a man who had called him greedy on a surveillance tape. He made the distinction explicit. Not to his wife, not to his son, but to the prosecutors who debriefed him over the weeks that followed. He was not cooperating out of remorse. He was not cooperating out of ideology. He was cooperating because John Gotti had broken the loyalty that was the only thing that could have kept him quiet. Remove the loyalty, and there was nothing left to protect. That distinction between what he would and would not do is the coldest thing about the entire story. He wasn't a man who broke. He was a man who recalculated. What Gravano set in motion did not stop with Gotti's conviction. The testimony he provided was used in subsequent prosecutions that reached into every corner of the Gambino family. Captains were indicted. Soldiers were indicted. Associates who had operated for decades without federal exposure suddenly found themselves named in proceedings built on Gravano's account. The infrastructure Gravano himself had helped construct. The construction rackets, the union influence, the political connections, was systematically dismantled by prosecutors who now had a map drawn by the man who had built it. The Gambino family did not disappear. It still exists in diminished form. But the version of the Gambino family that had made it the dominant criminal organization in America, the version built by Carlo Gambino, extended by Castellano, and operationally managed by Gravano. That version ended in a federal courtroom in Manhattan in April 1992. Gravano served 5 years. He was relocated under witness protection. He subsequently ran a drug distribution operation in Arizona, was convicted, and served additional time. He has since given extensive interviews, written a book, and maintains a public presence. He is in his late 70s. He is alive. John Gotti died in federal prison on June 10, 2002. He was 61 years old. The chair in the hospital room was empty at the end. Gravano did not go. Salvatore Gravano spent 40 years building a loyalty so ironclad that no prosecutor, no threat, and no amount of evidence could touch it. And then John Gotti put a surveillance tape in a room, called him greedy behind his back, and handed the federal government the one man in America who knew exactly how to take everything apart.